About this with Lucy Maxwell, who's the co-director of Climate Litigation Network, joining us from London. Lucy Maxwell, thanks for your time with us on Al Jazeera. So you must be pleased with this ruling. What's your sort of initial reaction?
Absolutely. This is a groundbreaking ruling for communities around the world who are very concerned that their governments are not acting in line with the science and aren't standing up to protect their human rights. So it has huge implications for this global movement that already exists of communities turning to the courts as a last resort to hold their governments accountable. Not just in Europe, but around the world. There are many cases that are happening right now where people will be looking at this judgment from the European Court of Human Rights and finding huge solace in what the court has established, that climate action is a legal duty.
What are the implications? Go ahead.
Yeah, the implications of the ruling. Fundamentally, what the highest human rights court in Europe has affirmed is that the climate crisis is a human rights crisis and that governments have legal duties to act in line with the science to significantly increase their efforts to combat climate change. What this means is that all of the governments around the world must act in line with the science, especially before 2030. A lot of the court's ruling focuses on the weaknesses of the Swiss government's efforts before 2030, which is really important because we know that now is the critical decade if we're to have any chance of preventing the worst aspects of climate change.
What do you make of some of the government's arguments that the case should not be admitted and that climate policy should be the subject of national governments rather than international courts?
Right. So the European Court's decision is very clear that this is a legal question because the consequences are so significant for the enjoyment of all of our human rights. And so it's not a matter just for politics. The European Court has affirmed what other courts in many countries around the world have found, that it's appropriate at a certain point for communities to take their cases to court and for the courts to scrutinise what the governments are doing in their name and whether those actions stack up against the climate science that governments themselves have affirmed and adopted year after year at the international level. So this is a legal question because the consequences of the climate crisis are so significant and there are human rights at stake, as we all very well know.
Just a final thought from you on, you think that this is really going to pressure governments going forward?
Absolutely. Governments are already facing litigation around the world. 7 or 8 of the governments in Europe have pending cases against them. This will be a huge boost to those cases. But communities don't need to turn to the courts. This ruling should go directly to the governments themselves to ramp up their climate action so that no one has to go back to court to start new cases, so that they're acting in line with the science. That's what we want to see.
All right, Lucy Maxwell, thanks so much for speaking to us from London.
Thank you.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.